The man looking at you right now will decide whether you eat this week. He is not looking at your face. He hasn't looked at your face since you were brought out, since the Magister Auctionarius made you stand on the stone and turn, and the crowd pressed forward in the way crowds press forward at markets when something has caught their interest. He is looking at the rest of you. His eyes move the way a man's eyes move when he is calculating. Not desire, not yet, but the colder thing that precedes desire when money's involved. There is a placard around your neck. You cannot read what it says. You know that it says something about your origin, the province you came from, the approximate number of years you have lived, whether you are considered sanus, sound, free from defect. You know there are other words for what you are for. One words the Magister used when he introduced you to the crowd, in that practiced, bored voice of a man who has sold hundreds and stopped attaching narrative to the merchandise. You are standing on the stone in a market in Rome, and the sun is too hot, and your feet have stopped hurting because they have been hurting for so long that the pain has become simply the condition of existing. You have been here before. Not this market, not this stone, but this moment, the turning, the inspection, the calculating eyes. You have been here before, in 3 other cities, in 2 other provinces, across a distance that you have stopped trying to measure, because measuring it requires remembering where you started, and remembering where you started is the thing that is most dangerous to do. The man with the calculating eyes raises one finger. The bidding begins. You were not always standing on a stone. That is the sentence you say to yourself. Not often, not as often as you used to. But sometimes in the hours before the household wakes, when there is a sliver of time that belongs to no one in particular, you say it. I was not always standing on a stone. It is not comfort exactly, but it is a fact, and in a life that has stripped away almost everything else, facts are a form of anchor. You came from Bithynia, the province on the southern coast of the Pontus, a place of mountains in the interior and fishing towns along the water. A place where Greek was spoken in the markets and Latin was spoken in the courts, and your mother's language was spoken at home, in the early mornings when the world was still yours. You were the son of a craftsman, a man who worked bronze, not a great man, not a man whose name would appear in any document, but a man who owned his tools and his trade and a small house on a street that had a name, and that name mattered to the people who lived on it. You were 17 when the situation changed. Situacho. The Romans would say it that way, as if circumstances were simply a neutral arrangement of facts rather than the mechanism by which one human being is reduced to the possession of another. The situation changed. The man your father owed money to, a local merchant with connections to a trading concern in Nicomedia, who had extended credit at terms that looked reasonable until they stopped being reasonable, arrived with 2 men and a document. The document had been validated by the local Dumviri, the magistrates of the town, whose seals appeared in wax at the bottom in the way that made it official, made it final, made it the kind of thing that could not be argued with without resources you did not have. Your father's debt was recorded. The debt could not be paid. You, a healthy son of appropriate age and apparent quality, were assessed as partial satisfaction of the obligation. This was legal. This was, in the language of Roman commercial law, a perfectly ordinary transaction. You were walked to Nicomedia in 3 days. You were kept in a ergastulum, a locked holding facility, for 2 weeks with 11 other people in circumstances that you have decided not to reconstruct in your memory, if you can help it. Then you were walked to a ship, and then the sea, and then the stone. The man who bought you in your first market was a dealer, a venaliciarius, which meant he was not your final destination, but your penultimate one. He dealt in what the trade called pueri delicati, decorative boys, pleasure servants, and he was professional about it in the way that made it worse somehow than if he had been cruel. He was not cruel. He was simply organized. His name was Titus Salvianus, and he operated a ludus, a training house, outside Capua. And what was trained there was not fighting, as in the famous gladiatorial schools nearby, but something else entirely. Presentation, language, music in some cases, the management of expression, how to seem composed when you were not composed, how to be present without being, in any meaningful sense, there. In obsequium, the Latin word for the compliance that was expected of you, that was baked into your legal status, that was not merely a preference but an obligation enforceable under Roman law. The word means service. It means yielding. It means the disposition of a being who has understood, fully and finally, that their will is subordinate to another's. Salvianus did not teach obsequium through punishment mostly. He taught it through the removal of everything else. You were sold to your current master 14 months ago. His name is Gaius Petronius Rufus. He is 43 years old, a man of the equestrian order, the second tier of Rome's aristocracy, below the senatorial class but far above the mass of the city, with a fortune built on shipping contracts and a house on the Aventine Hill that overlooks the Tiber on clear days. When he has a wife, he has 2 children who live in the house. He has 3 other slaves in personal service and approximately 40 in the household's broader operation. He is not a bad master. You have learned in the years since Bithynia that this phrase, not a bad master, does the most dishonest work of any phrase in your internal language. You use it as a kind of barricade. Behind the barricade, the actual contents of your existence. In front of it, a manageable description that allows you to function. Gaius Petronius, Rufus is not a bad master means he does not beat you without reason. He does not deny you food. He does not loan you to other men, which is a thing that masters can do, and some masters do routinely. And the fact that he does not do it is a form of, you hate the word, protection. You live in a small room off the tablinum, the study, which is where a house slave of your specific function is typically quartered. Close enough to be available, separated enough to be discreet. The room has a sleeping mat and a wooden chest for the few items you possess, and a small lamp that you are allowed to burn for 2 hours in the evening if the oil is not low. You have one friend in the house. Her name is Mira. She is a Syrian woman, perhaps 30, who manages the household linen and has been with the family for 9 years. Long enough that the wife, Petronia Flavia, treats her with something approaching confidence. Mira knows things. She knows the rhythms of the household, the patterns of the master's mood, the days when requests will be met with indifference versus irritation. She tells you these things not out of warmth. Exactly, and warmth is a luxury that requires more safety than either of you has, but out of a practical solidarity. On these days, be invisible. On these days, be present. On the Ides, he drinks. After he drinks, stay in your room. You owe Mira more than you can repay. She asked nothing. What you know about your legal status would fill a document, because it does fill documents. Roman law was nothing if not thorough in its treatment of property. You are a service, a slave. In legal terms, you have no persona, no legal personhood. You cannot hold property, though slaves sometimes did by informal arrangement. You cannot testify in court except under torture, which is prescribed by law as the only reliable way to extract testimony from a person who has no stake in truthfulness. You cannot marry, although those slaves formed lasting bonds that everyone acknowledged and no one protected. You cannot refuse. Refusal, in the formal legal sense, does not exist as a category available to you. Your situation is distinct even within slavery by one specific designation that appears on the document of sale from Salvianus to your current master. The word exilatus. It refers to an adult male slave kept for the purposes you serve. Roman law was, in its typical way, very precise about this. The Digest of Justinian would later catalog these distinctions with the dispassionate thoroughness of a taxonomy. You are a category. The category has a name. The name has a legal history going back centuries. The philosopher Seneca, a man who wrote about the dignity of human beings with genuine elegance and who owned hundreds of slaves, argued that masters should treat their servi humanely because they were human. He argued this without apparent awareness of the contradiction. You have heard his name mentioned in the household. The master sometimes quotes him at dinner. There is the life that is visible, and there is the life inside the life. The visible life. You attend to the master's personal needs. You are present at the convivium, the dinner parties that are the central social ritual of Roman aristocratic life, where you serve, where you pour, where you stand in the background in the way that furniture stands in the background, which is to say obviously present and deliberately unseen. While you accompany him on some mornings to the Forum, the civic heart of Rome, the place of law courts and commercial transactions and political performance, walking 2 steps behind in the manner prescribed for attendants of your kind. The Forum is where you have learned the most about the world that owns you. You watch men argue cases before magistrates using the full technical apparatus of Roman law, citing precedents, presenting tabulae. the wax tablets of formal agreements, appealing to the praetor in language of extraordinary precision about rights and obligations, and the proper interpretation of contracts. Men argue in this space about the ownership of a piece of land with the same intensity that other men argue about their lives. The law is very detailed about property. You are property. And the forma, the physical appearance that the slave market assessed and Salvianus trained and your master purchased, is your one asset in a world where you have no assets. You understood this early, not as vanity, but as strategy. The slave whose usefulness is visible is safer than the slave whose usefulness has become ambiguous. You maintain what was purchased, not from pride, from the same mathematical clarity with which you approach everything now. There is a man named Lucius who comes to the house periodically. He is a friend of the master, a man of roughly equal social standing, a business associate in some of the shipping arrangements. And he is the person in your life you fear most carefully, not because he is violent, because he is the kind of man who notices things that he is not supposed to notice and says them aloud in the hearing of others in a way that cannot be easily ignored. He noticed that you speak Greek. He mentioned it at a dinner in that casual, exploratory tone that powerful men use when they are testing whether something has value. Your Bithynian boy speaks Greek? Properly? Attic? The master said, well enough. Lucius said, I know a man on the Palatine who would pay a remarkable sum for a Greek-speaking exolitus. His current one is getting too old. There was a pause. You stood against the wall with the wine, and you kept your face exactly as it needed to be, and you counted your heartbeats and waited. The master said, he's not for sale, and Lucius smiled in the way that men smile when they have made a note of something for future reference, and the conversation moved on, and you refilled the cups. That conversation was 6 months ago. You have not stopped thinking about it. Slavery in Rome is not a permanent condition. This is the thing that makes it different from some other systems. The legal mechanism of manumissio, the formal liberation of a slave, which can be accomplished through several means and which creates, upon completion, a new legal status. Libertus, a freedman. A libertus is not a citizen, not fully. He carries obligations to his former master, the patronus, that persist for life and are enforceable at law. He owes labor, he owes deference, he owes certain services, but he can own property, he can appear in court. His children born after manumission are full citizens. The chain is real, but it has an end. You know this because Mira told you, carefully and in pieces, the way information is passed in a household where walls have ears that belong to people with their own calculations to make. You know that the master has freed 2 slaves in his life. Both were older men who had served for decades. Both were freed in his testament, in the will, which meant they would have to wait for him to die. You know that a manumissio inter amicos, a liberation before witnesses, informally, is faster but less legally secure. You know that a manumissio vindicta, before a magistrate, using the formal rod called the vindicta that the praetor touches to your shoulder in the ceremony, is the most complete form, conferring the fullest rights. You know what it would take to be freed during the master's lifetime. You have thought about it at length. The calculation is not romantic. It is entirely practical. To be freed before his death, you would need to be valuable enough in freedom to justify the loss of your value in slavery. A slave freed and kept as a client is still a resource. A skilled freedman in a trade or a business arrangement can generate more for a patronus than the same man kept as property. This is the argument you would make if you were ever in a position to make it. You have been making it silently for 14 months. You have been learning things the master finds useful, not in a way that announces itself. The slave who is visibly strategic is the slave who makes masters nervous, but quietly, in the way that rain accumulates. You have learned the names of the shipping contracts. You have learned enough Latin legal terminology to follow conversations in the forum that most attendants simply ignore. You have been, when appropriate and never presumptuously, useful in ways that extend beyond your defined function, Mira noticed. She said, one evening when the household was quiet, be careful, useful is good, indispensable is dangerous. A man does not free what he cannot replace. You thought about that for a long time. In the late autumn of your 2nd year in the house, something happened that you had not prepared for. The master's wife came to find you. Petronia Flavia was a woman of 38, the daughter of a senatorial family, which meant she had grown up with a clearer understanding of Roman social architecture than her husband, and a colder one. She was not cruel to the household slaves. She was not kind either. She operated in the mode of a woman who has decided that the emotional texture of her relationship to her property is not worth examining. She found you in the tablinum in the morning, transcribing letters. This was not your function. It was something the master had asked you to do 3 months earlier, one afternoon when his regular secretary was ill, and the correspondence was urgent, and your Greek literacy had already been established, and the Latin had followed it, quietly, in the accumulation of your months in the forum. The master had watched you work and said nothing, and the next day asked you again. Petronia Flavia stood in the doorway and looked at you transcribing letters, and her face did something you had not seen it do before. She asked you, not a slave master inflection, but a direct question, can you write a contract? You told her what you knew. She told you what she needed. Her brother, a man named Lucius Aemilius, a lawyer of middle standing in the city, was involved in a property dispute. A dispute over a small house near the Tiber that had belonged to their father and whose inheritance had not been properly documented at the time of his death 8 years ago. The relevant records, the tabula testamenti, the will tablets, had been stored with a notary who had since died, and the successor notary claimed he did not have the document. And without the document, Lucius Aemilius's claim to the property was vulnerable to a counterclaim by a cousin with sharper lawyers and fewer scruples. She needed someone who could research the chain of record, who had access to which tabularium in Rome held the relevant property registrations, how a formal querela in officiosi testamenti, a challenge to a defective will, was properly initiated, what documentary evidence could reconstruct the original disposition in the absence of the will itself. She was asking a slave to do the legal research that her free brother had not known how to do. You told her you would try. You spent 3 weeks in the records. Not conspicuously. A slave accompanying a free person to the tabularium is unremarkable, and you arranged 2 occasions through Mira's careful management of the household schedule. What you found was not the will, but it was adjacent to the will, a property registration in the census records of 8 years prior that listed the house under the father's name with the notation destinata filiis, intended for his sons. Not legally conclusive, but useful. The kind of thing a skilled lawyer could leverage into a claim strong enough to force a settlement. You gave the information to Petronia Flavia. She gave it to her brother. Her brother's lawyers used it. The cousin settled. Petronia Flavia came back to you in the tablinum 1 week later and looked at you for a long moment and said nothing and left. The master called you to the tablinum in early December. It was morning. Mira had told you 2 days earlier that there had been a conversation between him and his wife, a quiet one in the private rooms, and that the word manumission had been spoken, not as hypothesis, but as though it were already being considered. She told you this with the same flat tone she told you everything, the tone that had learned not to carry hope because hope was weight, and weight slowed you down. You stood before him. He was at the desk. He had a piece of wax tablet in his hand, and he looked at it for a moment and then looked at you. He said, "My wife tells me you are useful in ways I have not been using." You said nothing. Agreement would have been presumptuous. Denial would have been absurd. He said, "I've been thinking about the Nicomedean contracts, the shipping arrangements with the eastern routes. I need someone who speaks Greek, reads documents, knows the legal texture of commercial agreements. Not a secretary. Something between a secretary and an agent. Someone who travels with me." He put the tablet down. He said, "A freedman in that role serves me better than a slave. A slave cannot represent me in a negotiation. A freedman can." He let that sit. Then he said, "I'm going to Puteoli in March for the spring shipping contracts. I'd like you with me as a freedman, rather than as what you currently are." You felt something you had not felt in years. You were careful not to show it. You said, "I am grateful." He nodded and looked back at his desk in the way of a man who has made a business decision and moved on to the next one. And you walked back through the atrium and found Mira in the linen room and told her, quietly, and she looked at you for a long moment and then looked away, and her mouth did something brief and controlled that was, you understood, to the closest thing to joy she permitted herself. For 9 days you moved through the house differently, not visibly, not in any way that anyone would have named, but differently. On the 10th day, Lucius came to dinner. He brought a man with him, a man you had not seen before, older with the compact authority of someone from the senatorial class, wearing a toga with the broad purple stripe of a vir clarissimus. He was introduced to the master as Marcus Acilius Strabo. The master's face when he was introduced told you something. A slight, specific adjustment. The face of a man who is aware he is in the presence of someone whose goodwill he values. Dinner was served. You stood against the wall. Lucius, toward the end of the meal, said, Strabo, you mentioned you were still looking for someone with Eastern Greek for your Antioch interests. Strabo said, I am. The man I had retired 3 years ago. I haven't found a replacement I'm satisfied with. Lucius said, Rufus has a Bithynian, Greek-speaking, apparently useful in commercial documentation. There was a pause. The master said, carefully, cautiously, he's being manumitted in the spring. Strabo looked at you the way the man at the first auction had looked at you. He said, how much for the contract before the manumission? The legal mechanism was this. A slave whose manumission had been promised but not yet executed was still property. The promise of manumission created no legal obligation that could be enforced by the slave against the master. A sale would terminate the promise. It was perfectly legal. When the master said nothing for a moment, you stood against the wall. You looked at the wall. He did not sell you that night. He said, and you heard every word from against your wall, he's not for sale. The arrangement is made. Strabo inclined his head. Lucius smiled in the way that meant he had expected this. The dinner continued. You refilled the cups. But 3 days later, Lucius came back alone. You know this because Mira told you. You know what was discussed because Mira is very good at knowing what is discussed. The offer was substantial, not merely what you had cost the master at the Capuan auction, but something considerably beyond it, because Strabo was a man who paid for quality and considered the premium reasonable. Lucius framed it, apparently, not as a transaction, but as an opportunity. Why liberate an asset when you can realize its full value? The master told Lucius he would think about it. He told Mira nothing. The weeks between that conversation and the morning you are going to describe next are the longest of your life in Rome. You went about your function, you transcribed letters, you stood at dinners. You did not ask Mira for information she didn't offer, because asking would have created an anxiety that neither of you could afford. You slept on your mat in your small room, and you looked at the ceiling, and you did the thing you had learned to do in the ergastulum in Nicomedia, and on the ship, and on the stone. You separated the future from the present, and refused to let the future into the room with you, because the future could kill you in ways the present could not. Why? And the present at least had a lamp. The morning came. He called you to the tablinum again. Different morning, same desk. But his face was different. Not the business decision face of the first conversation. Something harder to read, something that had arrived at a position through a road he was not comfortable describing. He said, the arrangement stands. The spring, Puteoli. He said it the way a man says a thing he has decided to say before he changes his mind. Quickly, so it is said. You said, thank you. He said, well, there are conditions. The obligation of patronage will be formal and recorded. You'll continue in a service capacity for 3 years. You'll carry documentation. You said, I understand. He looked at you. He said, and this was the sentence that you will carry for the rest of your life. In the sentence that was not kindness exactly, but something in the neighborhood of acknowledgement. You should have been a secretary's son, not a craftsman's. You said nothing, because there was nothing to say to a man who had just described, without meaning to, the entire mechanism of the world he lived in. A world in which where you were born and to whom determined what you were allowed to become, a world that had taken a craftsman's son from Bithynia and turned him into property and then turned the property back into a person as an act of business calculation, and in which the man performing the calculation considered himself and was considered by everyone around him a good man. In March, you travel to Puteoli. You stand on the harbor and watch the ships come in from the east, from Alexandria, from Antioch, from the Pontic ports, or from the direction of a province you have not seen in 5 years, and you are holding a document. The document has been validated by a praetor's vindicta, witnessed by 3 men of standing, recorded in the municipal register. It names you. It gives you the Latin name the master has assigned in the formal ceremony. Gaius Petronius Bithynicus, the freedman's name that brands its origin even in its liberation. It gives you a status. It does not give you back Bithynia. It does not give you back your father's house on the street with a name. It does not give you back the 17 years before the document that changed everything, or the years on the stone, or the ergastulum, or the ship, or the training house in Capua, or the wall at the dinner party, or any of the 1,000 mornings you woke up on the mat and said, I was not always standing on a stone. What it gives you is this: the legal capacity to stand in a Roman court of law as a person rather than an object, the right to own what you earn, the right to a name that appears in a register as something other than property. You look at the ships. You think about Mira, still in the house on the Aventine, still managing the linen, still telling the new slaves which days to be invisible and which days to be present. You think about the thousands of people who came off ships like these and stood on stones like yours, and whose names appear in no register, whose liberation will come only in a testament read after a death or not at all. You think about the philosopher the master quotes at dinner, the one who wrote about human dignity from the comfort of an estate maintained by people who had none. You fold the document carefully. You put it inside your coat. You watch the ships.